Hello, my name is Oles Andrichuk. I'm a lecturer in law at the University of Stirling, UK, and this is Competition on the Merits, podcast on antitrust. Every week I invite an academic or practitioner to share with us some ideas on a specific aspect of competition policy, economics, law and philosophy. I do hope you'll enjoy the program. Do you agree with the statement that Dynamівці Києва – це найкраща команда у світі? Confused? Well, a similar confusion occurs when the word econometrics appears in legal antitrust discourse. Not only many lawyers, even in such otherwise economics-friendly discipline as antitrust, are suspicious about the ability of econometrics to be a reliable predictor for antitrust purposes, we often simply do not understand its language. Well, whatever we might think about econometrics, its role becomes increasingly important in antitrust, and many contemporary lawyers are getting as successful in navigating through the fine-spun mathematical symbols as they were in twinning their argument from the casuistic glosses of case law. Peter Ormozzi belongs to those antitrust specialists who have been trained both as an economist and as a lawyer. And although he doesn't promise to teach us mathematics in 20 minutes, he will definitely be very helpful to understand the very role of econometrics in antitrust analysis, its main apparatus, goals and problems. Peter Ormozzi is a lecturer at the University of East Anglia Norwich Business School, and he is also a member of the ERSAC Centre for Competition Policy at the University of East Anglia, UK. I invited him today to Competition on the Merits to discuss the role of econometrics in antitrust analysis. Peter Ormozzi, welcome to Competition on the Merits.
Thank you, Oles. It's great to be here.
And if the following conversation will generate some suggestions on your part, do tell us what you think by emailing to competitiononthemerits@googlesites.com. We are really interested to learn your opinion. This call is not just a formality. And as far as the mere formality is concerned, it goes without saying that the views expressed in this conversation are strictly personal. They do not represent an official position of the institutions which the speakers are affiliated to. So let us start with explaining the goals of econometrics in antitrust, and also with clarification of some its most obvious shortcomings, the shortcomings which are acknowledged by the discipline itself. In other words, let us start with what any econometrician would ever dare to say with an absolute certainty. Let's define the limits, so to say.
My impression, having both a legal and an economics background, is that quite often lawyers struggle with accepting the world as probabilistic. Economists typically talk about events having some probability of happening, whereas lawyers, they always like to see things as being certain, so they expect some sort of certainty. So when economists say that there will be a price increase, what they really mean is there is a 95% chance that there will be a price increase. This is a concept that lawyers sometimes, I feel, struggle to deal with. To me, it's surprising because I do also believe that lawyers use probabilities in their work. If you think about evidence, where you have to make up an evidence that stands on the balance of probabilities, or where you have to say something that without reasonable doubt, that none of these events are certain. So there is a probability element there. I think what we just sort of have to accept is that the way we're able to measure the world and the economy is necessarily stochastic. So it's necessarily probabilistic, and hence we don't really talk about certainty.
So how would you define the motto of econometrics?
I think it comes down to the issue of what is measurable. We like to quantify things, simple things that are measurable, and quite often it is, when we talk about economic analysis, quite often it's price. We'd like to see other things. We'd like to know how quality changes, how consumer choice changes. We simply haven't got, or quite often we haven't got the information on these things. So we pick up something that's most easily measurable, and that's often is price. Sometimes we have information on costs and so on. And these are necessarily quantitative. So we will use this in our analyses, but it doesn't mean that it has to be quantitative. There is a vast amount of literature on qualitative works, something I'm not so familiar with. And our work on impact assessment is purely quantitative. So I do understand that there is some sort of skepticism about these. But what I was trying to say previously, the key thing that really distinguishes a lawyer and an economist is that sort of willingness to interpret something in a way that might not give you a satisfying answer to your question, but still give you an answer to at least some of your questions. So you might say that, okay, I'd like to know exactly what happened as a result of an intervention. And an economist would tell you, well, I can tell you that this didn't happen. Or I can tell you that at best, this much happened. But of course, I might not be able to tell you exactly what happened. And that might be the source of a skepticism, because then a lawyer might struggle with, okay, well, what do I do with an information that something less than what this guy is claiming happened? And an economist would say, well, this is already a lot of information, because we know that we did at least this much, but not more.
So how would you design your introductory course of econometrics to antitrust lawyers?
If I had to do any sort of qualitative training for lawyers, I would definitely start with how to interpret data and how to interpret findings, and how important it is that you might still have really strong findings, but you have to be very careful how you interpret it. And you don't try to say too much into your data. You don't try to kind of assume that you are really giving the solution to life and you actually solving the everything. You have to make sure that your interpretation is as limited as your results truly are.
In the media in general and in the antitrust circles in particular, we sometimes hear the stories about statistics and about econometrics that the data were not prepared properly, that some people tend to manipulate data, to adjust their data to the final objectives of their research. And obviously this doesn't help to maintain credibility of econometrics. So my question is, how easy for an econometrician to understand whether the research which has been put forward uses genuine data, genuine conclusions, or rather plays with data, cooks it up somehow in order to mislead the public?
I think econometrics has developed a lot in the last 30 years. In the early 80s, there was a very important paper by Ed Leamer. And this paper, which was called How to Take the Con Out of Econometrics, basically set out some of these issues that you just mentioned, Olis, is that how do you know that what's going in the background in that econometric analysis is not something that someone just artificially made up. To use an analogy, you could think of this as you just mentioned the word cooking up, it's as something that goes on in the kitchen. What you really see when you go to a restaurant is the food on your plate. And you don't really see the process that had been going on in the kitchen. You'd like to trust it, but of course you have limited information on how that was done. And so basically Ed Leamer suggests that the way to overcome this problem, or at least one step of increasing the credibility of econometric estimates, is that we econometricians have to start providing more what we call a sensitivity analysis, which means that, okay, we do choose one model that we think describes what's going on in real life, and this model gives us these nice results, and everything seems to be ticking in the right place. But we also should provide alternative models and see how that changes our results, because it could be that really what was happening, but we had to run thousands of regression, and eventually that we find one which gave us the result that we wanted to see. Now, of course, if you are required to provide these type of sensitivity analysis, then this sort of issue would come up immediately. And more so when it comes to publishing empirical work, this is required from researchers. It's also required that access to the data is provided, so people can actually verify if that is credible. So I do feel that in the last 30 years, a lot has been done to make econometrics a lot more credible. And I think a lot of the criticism now has been at least partly dealt with, quite often in a satisfying manner.
We were talking about negative externalities of the discipline. There is also a positive externality, which we often see in the discipline of law as well. In particular, this inclination to a pure doctrinal research, which can be perceived as a goal in itself, as an intellectual exercise of its own right and of its own importance. Do you face a similar problem in econometrics? Namely that, unlike in the previous case where you use your data opportunistically, in this situation you are concentrated on the performance of econometric formulas, on the playing with sophisticated equations for their own sake. How widespread this temptation is among the econometricians?
It is an issue. Well, one of the reasons why we always report descriptive statistics in empirical work is to show that, okay, well, now, without using the sophisticated and complicated models, this is what you see in the world. And this is the data that describes the part of the world that we're looking at. And that already could be a really important piece of information. Now, of course, the more someone gets into econometric modeling and econometric techniques, the more tempting it becomes to use them and to use more sophisticated ones. There is always a tendency for many people, I think, to be complicated just for the sake of being complicated, to look more scientific. It is purely my personal opinion, but I always struggle with imagining economics as being science, because fundamentally it is social science. We like to call it science, but we're dealing with different things than sciences which actually can be modeled in a controlled laboratory environment. So because of that, the borderline between theory and what we mean by theory and models, it becomes a little bit fuzzy, and we're not so certain anymore what we mean about that. And that's how I feel the profession is going. So we talk about theory, and we often just mean theoretical models. Whereas what models would really mean for a physicist is something that takes an abstract view of something, ignoring many other things that would just mess up the observation, and thinking, okay, if the world was such a controlled environment, this would happen. That doesn't equal to theory. Theory would mean that there is something that happens, typically, but it's got very little to do with the model itself. So the model is a limitation of the world. And because of that, of course, I'm not surprised that lawyers are quite often skeptical about it. It's based on assumptions. We use assumptions in econometrics. We use assumptions in theoretical economics. These are different types of assumptions. But of course, sometimes it could be hard for a lawyer to understand why we need these assumptions, and it actually might seem like something that we are only doing for the sake of running another exciting econometric exercise. And of course, it is tempting to do that. But I think it's very important that whatever we do is simple to interpret, because that means that we are remaining credible. I'm not suggesting that sophisticated methods are wrong per se, but I think that where there is a way of providing a simple mean to answer the same question, and we should always stick to that simple means. And I think it's just important for us to remain credible to the rest of the world.
So after having a look on the both sides of this coin, on the negative and then the positive aspects and externalities of the discipline, let me ask you whether you consider yourself more as econometrician or as an econometrician. Which part is more important in your research?
I like to think of myself as being at least partly an economist. The metric part, using statistics for economics, I don't think it should ever, at least not for me, dominate the economics part. We're not just talking about numbers, we're talking about people, and we're not just talking about an artificial population, we talk about the economy. So I think it's important to keep our role as economists, although we do empirical work and we do the metrics part, but it still remains extremely important that we are able to interpret our data and our findings as an economist would do. And that might be very different from what a statistician would do. So yes, to answer your question simply, I do econometrics as opposed to just statistics. So there is an extra element in there.
Is economics and econometrics a science?
It's something that I have been thinking about, but I'm not sure I got to a stage yet where I actually know what I really mean. But what I really think I mean is that in physics, for example, we have theories like the theory of gravity. that theory is universal. To model life and to model gravity often, or to be able to deal with, to work with it, we need to model it. And then we are modeling some part of life, some part of the theory that makes it easier to work with. So quite often, and it might only be semantics, but very often I feel when economists talk about economic theory, what they really mean is that what they do, they're modeling. And so they try to imagine a world in an abstract fashion where you can simplify things extremely so that it becomes easy to work with. That doesn't mean that whatever you find from those models, it necessarily becomes or should become theory. I think this is very important. I'm sure that, although this sounds very obvious, and I'm sure a lot of people think about it this way without even thinking about it, and so many people understand it this way. I think it's important to emphasize that, for at least for a mixed audience that includes non-economists as well.
If I understand correctly, the main language, the main apparatus in econometrics is defined in terms of consumer benefits and savings. We are obviously not talking today about the goals of competition law and policy, but could you just explain the main reason why the benchmark of consumer benefits is so ubiquitously used in econometrics?
Of course, as you mentioned, this is to do with the fact that competition authorities try to focus on consumer welfare. But just to go back in time a little bit, impact assessments have always existed. There's always been a requirement to any competition authority, for accountability reasons, to provide some measure of their impact. And it used to be very simple measures, just the number of cases, for example. And if there was an increase in the number of cases, it was interpreted as an increase in impact. And of course, methods have become more sophisticated. We have better access to more complex and sophisticated econometrics techniques. And the fact that we can now use high-performing computers to run these econometric estimations, we can, at least we're in a position to give a more, so to say, a more educated answer to what the impact was. The emphasis here isn't on more sophisticated, but on more credible and on more comprehensive of what's going on when there's an intervention. We have got to a point where now consumer benefit is reported. And this is what we mean by consumer benefit is typically, for most impact assessment, it's a component of three factors. So it's to do with the price increase that was avoided because of the intervention. It's to do with the affected market size. And it's to do with the duration for which the price increase would have taken had there not been an intervention. So you can think of this duration as that the length of time it would have taken for the market to self-correct without an intervention.
And then they have a follow-up question. Obviously, it goes without saying that the goals of competition policy and law should be measured in consumer welfare terms or in welfare terms. But why, in your view, econometrics is much less interested in such things as competitive process, as performance of the companies? At least some authors still argue that these dynamic aspects of competition are still very relevant in antitrust discourse.
Yes, of course, it would be something that I think most of us would like to see. If there is an intervention, it surely will impact much more than the prices. It will have an impact on innovation. It will have an impact on dynamic factors that just a lot more difficult to measure. And of course, these things are important, but I think it sort of brings us back to that sort of constraint that we have as econometricians, is that our work is always necessarily limited very strongly by the type and the amount of data we have available. And so it becomes extremely important that what we report is interpreted in the right way. When there's an impact estimate that's purely based on prices, then we don't claim that this is total impact. We say that, yes, part of the impact is this. This is the measurable impact. And I think the key role here for academics is to come in and be able to say something on what is not measurable, so that at least we have some idea about how far away these impact estimates are from the true impact. Which direction are they from the true? Are they overestimating? Are they underestimating the true impact? and so on. And of course, it has got little to do with the welfare standard that the competition authority is applying. We would like to see impact that eventually spins on to the whole of the economy, not just consumers. And of course, when we then talk about the dynamic context, these effects will ripple on to other parts and then will come back. So it becomes extremely difficult to measure. But like I said, again, it's important for us academics to sort of go into and try to answer these questions, because competition authorities will never do that. For obvious reasons, it's because they're not research institutions.
And also, we cannot talk about the intensity of the competitive process as such.
It's very ambitious, it would be, at least. There are what we call in our work longer term studies, which look at the impact of an intervention or a series of interventions on a longer time scale. So intervention happens, we wait a couple of years, and then we look back and we try to see what happened to the market, and we try to see how the market has evolved. And the problem with this sort of work is the longer we wait with our analysis, of course we'd like to wait long enough because we'd like to see all these dynamic impacts to pick up and to substantiate. But the longer we wait, the more difficult it becomes to find a counterfactual, to find a control market which we are comparing our market against. And so we might say that, oh, see, there was an intervention 2 years ago, and now if you look at the market, it's highly competitive, prices are down, it's very innovative, and so on. And you'd like to compare it to another market where the only difference is the lack of the intervention. You can talk about the impact of intervention if you can find what we call a counterfactual against which you can compare the market we're looking at. And of course, if some other impact comes in the meantime, you won't be able to distinguish from the impact that you're looking at. This is what's called a confounding effect. And so it is a strong trade-off that we'd like to wait longer to measure these dynamic impacts, but it then becomes more difficult to measure whether that was really an impact of the intervention or whether there was something else.
So how would you define the main goals of econometrics in building the bridges with other antitrust disciplines?
In one word, is credibility. Econometrics is an area where we have to remain credible, and we have to actually work really hard to remain credible. And I think the way to do that is to make sure that in any sort of analysis, we always have a good robustness check, we have a good sensitivity analysis, what would have happened had we used different assumptions. And that is inevitable, that as opposed to just reporting one single estimate that this was the impact, we clearly explain what the limitations of our estimates are, and so clearly just to make sure that whatever we do is credible to the public.
Peter Ormothy, thank you very much for sharing with us your fruitful ideas.
Thank you, it was great talking to you.
You've been listening to the Competition and the Merits podcast on antitrust. And if you enjoyed this program, why don't recommend it to your students? Please join us next Tuesday. Another week, another podcast on antitrust.